Look out, friends. The Borg is coming.
Resistance is futile.
Will you be assimilated? In March 2023, Saturn will move into Pisces and Pluto will move into Aquarius. Two huge astrological developments in the same month. Now on this channel, we've explored Pluto in Aquarius and its revolutionary history a few times already. But what about Saturn in Pisces? What does it mean that the cold sentinel at the boundaries of the cosmos is about to move into the visionary, self-sacrificing, boundaryless sign of Pisces? Well, Saturn in Pisces is correlated with more than its own fair share of revolutionary periods too. The French Revolution of 1789, the French Revolution of 1848, the publishing of the Communist Manifesto the same year, the New Deal of the 1930s and Stalin's Great Purge, the Civil Rights Act of the 60s, and China's Cultural Revolution, the end of apartheid in the 90s. With Saturn in Pisces, we see some of the great triumphs of the democratic egalitarian spirit and some of the great horrors of history. In this video, I'm joined by another special guest and a brilliant astrologer, Mo from Austral Tour. And together, we're going to explore the history of Saturn in Pisces. And we're going to explain what all this has to do with the Borg, Star Trek's terrifying cyborgs, space communists.
Full scan. Go to yellow alert.
The reason I say the Borg is because, people are, tired of austerity. They're looking for something to believe in and something to align themselves with. Pisces is the last sign. There's less of this focus on, the individual and more on the collective with that water sign emphasis, but also the Jupiter piece. And so it just makes me think of increasing consolidation, but with Saturn going into a Jupiter-ruled sign, it's like the consolidation of people around some sort of belief, maybe. So it just makes me think of the Borg.
But first, we need to start thinking about our symbols. Saturn in Pisces. In Saturn, we have the planet on the boundary of the cosmos, as it was known to traditional astrologers.
I think of that boundary between land and sea, which was really a big deal for the ancients. I like to joke that for them, crossing the sea was like going to space, because you don't know what's in the foreign expanse. Also, quite literally, when you look at its structure, it actually has rings, which is kind of funny when you think about that element of like having boundaries and containers.
Saturn's function is to patrol the limits of reality, rejecting or accepting that which might be. It's the ultimate gatekeeper. This is why it rules death, the ultimate ejection from reality. Yet it also rules things that are built to last, things that stand the test of time, the test of old father time, and which survive to great age.
Whether you're thinking about the Western or Vedic traditions, there's often implications related to service and people who are maybe not necessarily of high rank who perform necessary jobs. So there's a lot of connotations of labor with Saturn as well.
Now Saturn has been in its own signs, Capricorn and Aquarius, since late 2017. And around the time when Saturn conjoined with Pluto in late Capricorn on January the 12th, 2020, we saw the emergence of the COVID-19 pandemic. And soon after, Saturn moved into Aquarius, where it signified the building of structures that were needed to tackle the pandemic.
Okay, we had to restructure our ways of interacting with each other, the rules by which we engage with each other as humans. You have to realize that you're still a part of this natural ecosystem, even though we have these like really structured, abstract societies now. And you have to, use your human ingenuity to kind of protect against this particular threat.
This included the development of vaccines and technology used to manage the movement of populations and the spread of disease. And that technology hasn't gone away. It's there humming in the background of our current moment. And now Saturn is poised to move into Pisces. It enters the sign on March the 7th this year, and it won't leave for Aries for the first time until May the 25th, 2025. It'll retrograde back into Pisces on September the 1st, 2025, and then leave for the final time on 14th of February, 2026, when it will then make a conjunction with Neptune at 0 degrees of Aries, the first degree of the entire zodiac. So another factor is that Saturn is going to be co-present with Neptune the entire time it's in Pisces. Pisces is a place where the boundaries between you and me break down.
So with Pisces, what's interesting is you have Jupiter, which is a planet that is associated with friendship, with social cohesion, with meaning. There's a generosity that's associated with Jupiter. And so when you combine these things, you can kind of see how people, get to this logic of Pisces being this very collective and sacrificing sign, sacrificing for the greater good, or, uniting behind a sense of meaning.
And it's the last sign of the zodiac, the place where we rejoin the ocean of consciousness that's said by mystics to underlie our reality.
And so when you have this sort of collective cosmic soup, you can see how the progression through the zodiac is one of, self-differentiation, only to realize that, you're part of something whole and it's kind of dissolving you again. Saturn and Jupiter are, the greater malefic and benefic respectively. And they both kind of have opposite agendas. So while Saturn is trying to say no to things or create boundaries, Jupiter wants to not necessarily erase boundaries, but make things larger. And so when you have these two forces coming together, I think that people are looking for a sense of that belonging to something bigger. But obviously, there are maybe unspoken boundaries around that. Saturn in Pisces is kind of trying to test the limits of belonging, so to speak.
So what happens historically when Saturn, the great container, the great sentinel, is in Pisces? Well, in 1789, we saw the French Revolution, which overturned the absolute monarchy of France and installed a more egalitarian system, a system guided by the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity. And as with the period we're heading into, Pluto was in Aquarius at this time. So we saw a dramatic overturning of the center of the monarchy in favor of a more equal, more liberal system. And in 1848, with Saturn in Pisces again, there was another revolution in France and revolutions all across Europe. And in this period, we saw the replacement of absolute monarchies with more liberal nation states. And at the same time, Marx and Engels published the Communist Manifesto, a critique of industrial society that called for the sharing of resources in a way that favored working people and would, in theory at least, be more egalitarian.
When I think of Saturn in Pisces, I can also think of that sort of redistribution of resources in more of a fair way, because Jupiter is also a planet of wealth.
So Marx, who was born on May the 5th in 1818, when Saturn was in Pisces, came out with his masterwork, his great call to arms in 1848, with Saturn in Pisces again.
When I think of his Saturn in Pisces, I think of from each according to his ability to each according to his need.
And another one of the Communist Manifesto's cries was, "Workers of the world, unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains." Saturn was traditionally ruler of people who worked the land and more broadly of working people. There couldn't be a clearer expression of Saturn in Pisces here. And we see different expressions of this egalitarian spirit all over the world whenever Saturn is in Pisces. For example, in 1937, the US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, signed into law the Social Security Act, which created Social Security and unemployment insurance. This was a big part of FDR's New Deal, which was a series of programs to help the US recover from the Great Depression and help poorer Americans.
In the working out of a great national program that seeks the primary good of the greater number, it is true that the toes of some people are being stepped on.
And when Saturn returned again to Pisces in the mid-60s, we saw a very similar program, President Lyndon Johnson's Great Society program.
The Great Society rests on abundance and liberty for all. It demands an end to poverty and racial injustice.
And in 1964, LBJ signed the Civil Rights Act, which ended segregation. And in South Africa, there was Nelson Mandela.
It's funny because literally the week that Saturn ingressed into Pisces, Nelson Mandela gives his "I am prepared to die" speech.
It is an ideal for which I am prepared to die.
He gets arrested as a result of his, contributions to this sort of movement. In parallel, in the United States, you had the Freedom Summer kickoff in the US, where there were all these movements around enfranchising voters, especially throughout the South. And unfortunately, I think of the martyrdom that's associated with Pisces. There were a lot of activists who were going down to the South to help people get registered to vote. who, did end up losing their lives or, disappeared because they were challenging sort of that Jim Crow law that was established.
And if we move forward again through another 30-year Saturn cycle, we reach the early 90s.
In 1994, you have the ending of apartheid in South Africa with the first multiracial elections. Then this led to the election of Nelson Mandela as president, which is a funny way of coming full circle.
Now is the time for all South Africans to stand together.
So you can start to see how these transits interact with each other over time. Interesting, huh?
And then you had the Million Man March in Washington, D.C. in 1995, which was a march that was centered on the concerns of Black people in the U.S. So that even though you had the enfranchisement of Black people become codified into law with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, there's this element of not quite living up to what it means to be a, I guess, multiracial, multi-ethnic society that gets brought up during this Million Man March.
Now, if you want to know how astrology can help you find calling and purpose, or simply get a better understanding of the current times and how you fit into them, I'm currently available for private consultations, and I'd love to talk to you one-on-one. I use a combination of modern techniques that you'll know, progressions, transits, as well as some traditional ones you might not, such as the lots, such as decans, such as zodiacal releasing. If you're curious, please do think about booking a session. Details in the description below. Now, there is a darker side to these attempts to create more equality and coherence in society and prioritize notions like conformity and purity. In the 1930s, when FDR was signing the Social Security Act into law, the Communist Soviet Union, of which Russia was a major part, was ruled by the brutal dictator Joseph Stalin. And during this period, Stalin conducted his Great Purge. He used his secret police to identify, imprison, torture, and execute people he thought were plotting against him, people who could be accused of not being good communists, people who were affiliated with his rivals like Trotsky. An estimated 700,000 people were killed.
Interestingly, China, which will become relevant later, you have Mao, who is writing this Weibo Manifesto, which outlines a strategy for dealing with Japanese imperialism, trying to sort of coalesce the people of China around like the shared sense of meaning as you have this outside force coming in and forcing assimilation.
And if we go forward one Saturn cycle, with Saturn in Pisces again in the mid-60s, China was having its cultural revolution. This was an attempt by Chairman Mao to purge China of anti-communist elements using severe repression. Huge numbers of people were beaten, imprisoned, and humiliated, and many were killed. And children were encouraged to denounce their own parents for opposing communism. The Great Purge and the Cultural Revolution were brutal attempts to enforce ideological purity and maintain power.
When I think of Jupiter, the dark side of Jupiter, I think of forced assimilation, or this sort of attempt to get people to assimilate into a larger structure. And while that could have the benefit of expanding the circle of care, sometimes it does come at the expense of respecting people's beliefs and, maybe even their relationship to the resources. Because as we see with Stalin, he was a figure that ended up assuming sort of the collection of other people's resources for the greater good. But for people who didn't agree to that, not great consequences.
But we can see an archetypal similarity here, even with the more benign manifestations that we saw in the West, because these are all attempts to create more coherence in society. In some cases, we make people more equal. In others, we remove people we don't approve of. There have been other attempts to push warped visions of purity in societies while Saturn was in Pisces. For example, during the 30s, Adolf Hitler's Nazis enacted the Nuremberg laws. These laws formed the legal basis for the Nazis' genocide against the Jews and other peoples in Germany. They were a crucial step in the Holocaust. And during Saturn's last day in Pisces, in 1994, in the country of Rwanda, the Hutu majority population carried out a genocide against the Tutsi minority. Some 800,000 Tutsis and Hutus who didn't go along with it were murdered in an orgy of violence that lasted 100 days. So we see here extremely warped and evil attempts to make societies purer and more coherent. So there's a real potential for light and darkness with Saturn in Pisces. So what about our times? Well, with Saturn about to enter Pisces, what we can be sure of, I think, is that we're about to enter much more ideological times.
Having this sort of austerity come about with Saturn and Capricorn, reminding us of the hard realities of just existing. And then you had Saturn move into Aquarius, where it's like, okay, we realize how interconnected and interdependent we are, but like the reality is maybe we can't connect in the same way. I think that Pisces is that sort of culmination of, okay, we are more interconnected than we would like to admit. And so how do we organize ourselves around those ideas?
We're likely to see attempts to make societies more coherent and more equal. That may involve changing laws or founding organizations with radical revolutionary goals. And it may even involve purging those who aren't deemed to fit in. Jupiter, the traditional ruler of Pisces, will be in Taurus for 1 year of this Saturn transit, from the middle of May 2023. So we may see themes of money, food, resources, sex, land playing a big role here. But there are other big themes that we can discern from Saturn's transits through Pisces. In the early 90s, of course, we saw the birth of the World Wide Web, and in 1994, Tim Berners-Lee set up the World Wide Web Consortium, which sets the standards for the web. The Schengen Agreement, which allowed people in Europe to travel without a visa, came into force. The Channel Tunnel, a structure under the sea which connected Britain with the European mainland, opened, and the World Trade Organization, which regulates world trade, was founded.
Jeff Bezos actually founded Amazon in 1994 when Saturn was in Pisces. And Amazon was really just a bookstore at first, online. And it's interesting to think about what Amazon has become now. Amazon Web Services actually is like the backbone infrastructure of the majority of the world. Like the reason that a lot of websites are online is because of Amazon.
Going back further, in 1847, the US issued its first postage stamps. In 1876, Melvin Dewey invented the Dewey Decimal Classification System, a method of categorizing and arranging books on shelves in libraries. These are all Universalist systems which aim to structure and regulate the flow of information and people. So in the coming 3 years, look for the emergence of systems and technologies with these aims. And one thing that might fit that bill is central bank digital currencies. Pisces is often seen as a kind of dreamy, visionary sign. But it also has a lot to do with currency, which flows and connects us all together. And after all, Jupiter was the traditional ruler of wealth. And as we've seen, Jupiter will be in Taurus for much of this period. And we can also expect to see the establishment of new structures related to Piscean themes, like the sea, like the arts, like spirituality, like religion and petrochemicals over this time. With Neptune in Pisces, there's been a huge boom in magic and mysticism and astrology. We'll likely see new attempts to structure and regulate these areas. Saturn in Pisces has also seen some truly transformative inventions in the area of communications. Alexander Graham Bell filed a patent for the telephone in 1876, with Saturn in Pisces. The next year, Thomas Edison invented the phonograph, a device for recording sound. In 1937, we saw the first demonstration of radar to track aircraft. And in 1994, IBM released the first smartphone, the IBM Simon smartphone. Remember that? Me either. But what do all these revolutionary communication systems have in common? They all harness the invisible, yet very present oceanic sea of waves which underlies our reality. And they facilitate connection, and that's Piscean. So over the next 3 years, look for the invention of new information and communication technologies that go on to change the world. We have to bear in mind that drives towards making societies more coherent, more equal, more pure, will use information technology to further those goals. This is an age of air, after all. And here we return to our friends, the Borg.
And I will resist you with my last ounce of strength.
Strength is irrelevant. Resistance is futile. We wish to improve ourselves. We will add your biological and technological distinctiveness to our own.
The Borg are a network of what can only be described as cyborg space communists. The members of the Borg are assimilated into the collective and surrender their will. And so I wonder if the Borg are something of a warning from recent popular culture about what could go wrong. Saturn in Pisces with Pluto in Aquarius suggests that technology may well be used to try and create societies with more purity equality, and coherence. Specifics of how this could work aren't so clear yet, but look to tools like AI, central bank digital currencies, social credit systems for guidance. Those tools that were created to manage the pandemic could well be put to use for other ends. So there's a big potential for technological overreach here. After all, do any of us really want to join the Borg?
Your culture will adapt to service ours.
Impossible. My culture is based on freedom and self-determination.
Freedom is irrelevant. Self-determination is irrelevant. You must comply.
But I think it's overreach that will likely drive resistance and a movement towards decentralization. It's in this process of action, reaction, and synthesis that the future will be made.
So I think it's interesting that Saturn and Neptune are sharing a sign together, because you have this planet that is meant to give things form, Saturn, and then you have Neptune, which is this planet that tends to make the form more amorphous or kind of dissolve the form or distort it. And I think that Saturn and Pisces may favor something that is a little more decentralized or less, maybe less hierarchical.
Thanks so much to Mo for joining me in this video. Seek her out if you're looking to tap into some real astrological wisdom. Details in the description below.
So if you want to know more about how planetary cycles affect you, you can find me at astrologer on Twitter, Instagram, and Substack. I also offer consultations at my website, astrologer.com. You can also access that through Substack as well.
And if you enjoyed this video, you should watch this video next. It's the first in a 4-part series I made with astrologer S.J. Anderson on the astrology of the 2020s. It's going to help to put what we've said today about Saturn in Pisces into context and give you a better understanding of where the world is heading over the next decade. Thanks, and see you next time.